Yes. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I run the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, and I'm thrilled that so many of you are here tonight for our Courage to Be lecture series, part of our Practices of Courage courses at Bard. I'm not going to introduce our speaker. I just want to say a couple words about the center and what's going on in these Courage to Be courses. This is the first year of a 2-year pilot program for these Practice of Courage courses. We'll be having another series of courses in the pilot program next spring, so a year from now, and continue the lecture series then. And we're hoping that this will become a more regular event at Bard. We're applying for some grant money to make the Courage to Be program and the Practice of Courage courses at least a semi-permanent part of the Bard curriculum. So you guys are all the guinea pigs, and I'm thrilled that you're doing so, and I hope you're enjoying the courses. Just one or two quick announcements. We have 2 more lectures in the Courage to Be lecture series this year, or 1 more lecture and 1 other event. I know she's eating, so I'm going to be careful. It's Jean van Heeswijk. I'll get it for next time. Who's the Haring Fellow here in Human Rights and Art and Curatorial Studies, and she'll be talking on April, is it 27th. And then also, and that will be in the faculty dining room, the FDR. And also in May, Bill T. Jones, who some of you know is a resident dance company here, is one of the great dance choreographers in the country, and is a good friend of the Arendt Centers, who's a big fan of Hannah Arendt, has a new dance that he's recently choreographed about his mother-in-law, Dora, who worked in 2 of the Nazi detention camps in southern France as a woman who helped administer these camps and tried to, in a sense, help as many Jews in these camps as possible. And he has composed a dance performance based on interviews he did with her, which is simply stunning. It has not yet had its real premiere. I saw a dress rehearsal of it 3 months ago. It's about moral courage, and it's a beautiful performance. Because it's so late in the year when we can show it, which is May 6th? May 12th, I'm sorry, May 12th. We can't require you all to come because it's during finals, but it's only open to people in the Courage to Be and the Honor and Center Network, and it's going to be a presentation of this dance proposal. And I very much hope you can all attend that as well. It's really something pretty special and exciting. One other note, closer, next Monday, April 6th, we're going to have a day-long conference over at Weiss Cinema on property and freedom in South Africa, about the question of how to fight poverty through property regimes in South Africa. And we have some spectacularly important people from South Africa and England and other places coming. And I hope you all can attend that event if you have time. It's Monday the 6th next week. So that's my job. I hope you're enjoying dinner, the lamb. I'd like now to introduce one of our Hannah Arendt Center Courage to Be student fellows, Zelda Bass. She's a junior political science major and Hannah Arendt Center fellow, and she'll introduce tonight's speaker. So please welcome Zelda Bass.
Thank you. Thank you for all being here tonight and joining us in our second Courage to Be dinner lecture. My name is Zelda Bass. I'm a student fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center and third-year political studies major here at Bard. And before having the honor of presenting tonight's speaker, Uday Mehta, I would like to give you a little background on him. Professor Mehta is a distinguished professor of political science at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. He's a political theorist whose work encompasses a wide spectrum of philosophical tradition. He has taught at Princeton University, MIT, Cornell, the University of Chicago, and the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Mehta was an undergraduate at Swarthmore College, where he studied mathematics and philosophy, and he received his PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University. He's the author of 2 books, The Anxiety of Freedom, Imagination and Individuality in the Political Thought of John Locke, and Liberalism and Empire, 19th Century British Liberal Thought. In 2002, he was named a Carnegie Foundation Scholar. He's currently completing a book on the moral and political thought of Mahatma Gandhi, which will be titled A Different Version, Gandhi's Critique of Political Rationality. The Hannah Arendt Center was thrilled to have him a few years ago at our conference on truth telling in a world without facts. In his lecture entitled Is Lying a Political Virtue, he said, "For Gandhi, the devotion to truth has its analog in the high value placed on courage, both individual and collective. Courage was a quality for which no social or political artifact could serve as a substitute. As Gandhi said, the path of truth is for the brave alone, never for the coward." And I believe this quote resonates with a lot of us who are taking the courage to be classes. So it's a pleasure to have Professor Mehta here tonight, and please welcome me and give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege to be back at Bard. Thanks to Roger, who is a dear friend. I've been invited to Bard on a regular basis, and I am happy to say that I don't think there has yet been an invitation that I've turned down. I certainly don't plan to. Roger has really done something quite remarkable here. The Hannah Arendt Center really is a unique place, not just for the study of Hannah Arendt. It's a unique place for the study of ideas, for the study of important ideas. And I think all of you are very, very lucky to have somebody like Roger and the Arendt Center here. I also want to thank Roger's assistant, Tina, somewhere, who has got to be the best assistant anywhere. She's just wonderful. So I'd like to thank her. Yeah. In his well-known essay, What is Enlightenment?, Immanuel Kant gave a remarkably simple answer to the question that was posed in the title of his inquiry. Enlightenment, he said, was the human emergence from its self-incurred immaturity. Because the immaturity was self-incurred, its redress turned on 2 human qualities, courage and thinking. The motto of enlightenment, as Kant announced it, drawing on the Roman poet Horace, was sapere aude, dare to think. Among the many things that made this emphasis on courage and thinking remarkable and significant was that it identified enlightenment as something attitudinal, hence disassociating it from any particular time period or any region of the world or a level of material and cognitive achievement or with a series of social and political processes or, significantly, with a stage of civilizational and institutional development. In the 19th century, with thinkers such as Hegel, Marx, Herbert Spencer, and John Stuart Mill, it was precisely these sort of temporal processes and geographical markers that came to be associated with progress and modernity, and implicitly with enlightenment. Kant's position was starkly different. By refusing these distinctions, Kant was refusing to think of enlightenment in historical terms. It is a striking aspect of Kant's text is the rigor with which he absolves the idea of enlightenment with any teleological connection, either with the past or with an anticipated future. Courage, and specifically the courage of reasoning in public, referred simply to an attitude that embraced the reality of the present with a particular fortitude. Strikingly, Kant's essay did not rely on associating enlightenment with republican forms of governance, indeed with any specific form of governance beyond one which maintained public security. In this sense, his political purpose was not pegged to articulating a political or institutional vision, but to the narrow injunction of thinking and giving reasons in public. It is the giving of reasons in public that required courage. Enlightenment for Kant hinged simply on acting freely in public and the opportunity for the free exercise of public reasoning. Kant was, in effect, connecting three important terms or concepts: courage, public reason, and human dignity. What mattered to him, and as I will suggest in greater detail to Gandhi, was not the movement or the logic of history, understood in social and political terms, but rather a specific human attitude that featured the importance of courage. In this talk, I want to think about what it means to place courage and related notions such as a willingness to die at the center of one's conception of an ethical life, both for individuals and for collectivities. My focus is on Gandhi, for whom courage had a centrality that trumped even his opposition to the British Empire. In many ways, it was the informing creed of his life and the link between his ethical and political philosophy. For Gandhi, courage was the linchpin that connected the most mundane aspects of everyday existence with the transcendent. It is this link that I hope to explore. On the morning of February 24th, 1919, in a context vitiated by the recent introduction of the Rowlatt Bills, which proposed to all but explicitly suspend the individual rights of Indians, along with their rights of association and assembly, Gandhi, along with others, issued the Satyagraha Pledge, that is, the call for civil disobedience. It was an act which he called, and I quote, the most momentous in the history of India, end of quote. The pledge stated, and again I quote, in the event of these bills becoming law and until they are withdrawn, we shall refuse, civilly, to obey the laws. And we further affirm that in this struggle, we will faithfully follow truth and refrain from violence to life, person, or property. End of quote. In a telegram sent on the same day to the Viceroy's private secretary, Gandhi again emphasized that the proposed national satyagraha was to be a civil form of action. As he said, quote, it is much better that people say openly what they have in their hearts without fear of consequences and enforce the dictates of their own conscience. End of quote. What did Gandhi mean in this and in every other context where he issued the call for civil disobedience by insisting that such actions be civil? Why did civility, on his understanding, turn on notions such as conscience, truth, suffering, the dictates of the heart, the ability to be steadfast, the practice of fasting, the injunction to refrain from designating an enemy, the courage of being prepared to stand alone, and of course, abjuring from all forms of violence? Why did it ultimately rest on the willingness to be prepared to sacrifice one's own life? For Gandhi, civility was a mode of individual comportment, which had the crucial feature of tying ethics to politics in a way that never allowed the latter, namely politics, to assume an independent purpose and instrumentality. Civility referred to that kernel of what it meant to be human, that ember in the midst of social and political life that had the potential of constantly unsettling or inflaming those contexts with demands that invariably exceeded the contours of the social and the political by pointing to something beyond them. It referred to a metaphysical core of what it meant to be human. And because it could not be abstracted, and because of that, it could not be abstracted from issues of death, self-sacrifice, and courage. Ultimately, for Gandhi, civility represented the ineradicable presence and challenge of the absolute in the midst of the everyday routines of life and struggle. Returning to the events of the spring of 1919 and the call for satyagraha following the introduction of the Rowlatt Bills, Gandhi, as was his norm, was meticulous in his preparation, especially for actions which he had publicly authorized. In the months following the introduction of the Rowlatt Bills, Gandhi gave numerous speeches and published various circulars on how precisely people were to behave and the conditions that had to be satisfied for someone to be a satyagrahi. I want to summarize and paraphrase the instructions he gave to the volunteers who were gathering signatures from potential satyagrahis. Volunteers were to read and to explain in detail the summary that Gandhi had prepared of the Rowlatt Bills and the Satyagraha Pledge. Getting signatories for the pledge required explaining why the proposed bills were unjust, subversive of the principle of liberty and justice, and destructive of the elementary rights of individuals. Volunteers were to be mindful that a single genuine recruit who realized the responsibilities that came with signing the pledge was better than 100 signatories who did not understand the gravity of the matter. Second, volunteers were to elaborate the meaning and the significance of taking a vow, which the pledge amounted to. This required, quote, that volunteers must explain to the signatories the full significance of the word civilly. It involved something solemn. Like vows, civil actions, Gandhi said, were, quote, taken only in respect of matters otherwise difficult to accomplish. When, after a series of efforts, we fail in doing certain things, by taking a vow, we draw a cordon around ourselves from which we may never be free, and thus we avoid failure. Anything less than an inflexible determination cannot be called a vow. A vow was thus an exacting commitment regarding how to behave. A vow was, however, different from other intentions. It involved a self-consciousness about the conditions under which life itself was worth living. Hence, a self-consciousness about death and self-sacrifice. Such self-consciousness could only stem from sequestering oneself from the social and political context in which one found oneself. Hence the importance of cordoning oneself off, but crucially, while remaining in the midst of that context. A vow was neither an act of exit or of voice, but rather of deep and singular ethical self-consciousness. In part, as part of this, volunteers were to explain to the intended signatories that in signing the pledge, they were committing themselves, quote, to bear every kind of suffering and sacrifice, end of quote, and that they must, quote, be prepared to carry out the struggle single-handedly, even if left alone, end of quote. Only upon being fully satisfied that the potential signatories were willing and prepared to take these risks were they permitted to sign the pledge. The third broad condition was to the potential signatory. He or she was to be fully self-conscious that during the struggle they were to be fearlessly committed to the truth and to ahimsa, namely non-violence. Under no circumstances were they to misrepresent the truth, even if doing so would serve the national cause or undermine the imperial authorities. But above all, in acting civilly, the signatories were committing themselves to, quote, bear pain, endure suffering, and live with the consciousness that they were committing themselves to be prepared to die for their convictions. Gandhi's emphasis was on individual courage and integrity, which he identified as anchored in faith. Gandhi was clearly resisting linking civility solely with the claims of justice, thus giving them an independent normative credence, such that their gravity alone would be the basis of the behavior. In a manner that further delineated and raised the boundaries around the individual, the cordon around the self, Gandhi on April 12th issued additional instructions. There were to be no processions, no organized demonstrations, no work stoppages. All police orders were to be obeyed, no stone throwing, no obstruction of traffic, no pressure was to be exercised on anyone, including crucially on those who did not sign the pledge. At public meetings there was to be no clapping, no demonstration of approval or disapproval, no cries of shame, no cheers, indeed perfect stillness. There was to be no attempt to undermine or embarrass the government or the administrative authorities. There was to be no resistance offered while being imprisoned and no support shown for those who were imprisoned. All these stipulations served to further sequester the ground of the individual behavior from the febrile social and political context in which the individual found him or herself. If satyagraha and the forms of behavior that it mandated were political acts, they had to articulate themselves without resort to the idea of an enemy, or a comrade, or the power in numbers, or the expression of a collective will, or the ability by violence or other means to undermine the will of imperial authorities, or even the coordinated nature of protest. Gandhi eschewed all these familiar modalities of political action and protest. What he advocated had no resonance with either the vanguardism of the well-organized Leninist cadre or with the legal and representational challenge that liberal moderates had proposed, which after all turned on the logic of numbers. Indeed, even though satyagraha was projected as a national response to the bill, it was clear that all the conditions and constraints It was clear from all the conditions and constraints that Gandhi placed on its public forms and the demanding personal conditions that had to be met, that it was hardly designed to give a fillip to mass action. At points, Gandhi seemed even wary of encouraging large numbers of people to sign the pledge. In a speech given in Madras, he explicitly stated that it was not the number of signatories, but rather the purity and willingness of their sacrifice. As he said, it is not the numbers so much as the quality that we want. Let anyone therefore note down the qualities required. Let me therefore note down the qualities required of a satyagrahi. He must follow truth at any cost and in all circumstances. He must make a continuous effort to love his opponent. He must be prepared to go through every form of suffering, whether imposed upon him by the government, which he is civilly resisting, or by those who may differ from him. This movement is thus a process of purification and penance. Believe me, if we go through it in the right spirit, the rollet bills will be withdrawn and the country will recognize in satyagraha a powerful religious weapon. End of quote. There was something audacious. Some called it naive, yet others thought it as a subtle form of complicity with the imperial authorities, in Gandhi's firm conviction that the bills would be withdrawn by the utter lack of a calculus that distinguished friend and enemy, and supporter and opponent. From Gandhi's perspective, it made no difference that the love was extended to an opponent or to a friend, or that the suffering occurred on account of the government or others who were also critical of it, but who were at least nominally one's supporters, or that the truth was completely divorced from circumstantial and tactical considerations. Gandhi denied all these familiar categories and the logic that typically accompanied them, and through which we typically understand the rationale of political protest. Moreover, Gandhi denied the familiar understanding of political change and causality. If we take him at his word, he did actually believe that the purity of the penance and sacrifice offered by a handful of people could and would result in the revoking of bills that had the full statutory and material support of the mightiest political power on earth. It recalls his comments in his book Hind Swaraj, where he asserted that Swaraj, home rule or self-rule, itself did not require a mass movement, but could be had, as he said, in an instant, by the genuine fortitude of a few people. One can view such comments as empirical predictions, in which case their warrant seems implausible, and Gandhi's rhetoric overextended and unduly optimistic. But such a perspective misses the point. These claims are more interesting in suggesting how, on Gandhi's reckoning, the logic of political transformation was itself susceptible to civil and ethical practices, which were pegged to self-suffering and indifferent to familiar political and social categories, and which therefore defied the very terms in which the political understood itself. One stark implication of abjuring from familiar political categories, such as friend and enemy, in the context of the times, the British and the Indians, was that Gandhi did not hesitate from reversing the vector of civil action so that its object suddenly became the satyagrahis themselves, rather than the British and the Rowlatt Bills. In April, when there was the prospect of his imminent, that is Gandhi's imminent arrest, mayhem and many other forms of violence broke out in the city of Ahmedabad. Buildings were burnt, telegraph wires cut, trains stopped, shops plundered, and some people killed. Gandhi was horrified and ashamed. He said, quote, "A rapier run through my body could hardly have pained me more," end of quote. He insisted that full amends be made by the so-called satyagrahis for this behavior. Property losses were to be fully compensated. Public buildings rebuilt at no cost to the government. Financial collections were to be taken for those who had lost family members. But most strikingly, Gandhi informed the people of Ahmedabad, quote, "The occasion has arrived when I should offer satyagraha against ourselves for the violence that has occurred." He followed this by writing to the private secretary of the Viceroy, informing him in the most contrite terms, quote, "My satyagraha, therefore, will at the present moment be directed against my own countrymen," end of quote. This took the form of a fast. The core of Gandhi's notion of civil action and protest was the idea of self-sacrifice and a willingness to die. Coupled with these were the cognate ideas of fearlessness and courage. Nehru, in his Discovery of India, attributed the essence of Gandhi's teaching to be fearlessness. It was the same quality that George Orwell, in his insightful review of Gandhi's autobiography, singled out as the core of Gandhi's life and creed. But it is important to know that Gandhi's point was not meant as a preparatory response political response to a political predicament, but rather a civil and ethical retort to a political situation, while remaining in the midst of that political predicament. He does not espouse the typical ideas of fraternity, familial national belonging, and loyalty to a communal body as the reasons for courage, fearlessness, and sacrifice. Gandhi's most searching reflections into fear, courage, sacrifice, death, and civility belong to the context of the First World War. By the summer of 1918, Gandhi had come to the firm conviction that it was essential for India to contribute men who would be prepared to fight alongside the British and others in the war effort in Europe. This offer was to be unconditional and not pegged to the British introducing or promising to introduce any political reforms in India. As he said in a letter to the Viceroy, much of which he later reproduced in his autobiography, he said, quote, "I recognize that in the hour of danger we must," that is the Indians must, "as we have decided to, give ungrudgingly and unequivocally support to the British Empire." End of quote. He went on to say, "If I could make my countrymen retrace their steps, I would make them withdraw all the Congress, that is the Nationalist Party's, resolutions and not whisper a word about home rule or responsible government during the dependency of the war. I would make India offer all her able-bodied sons as a sacrifice to the empire at this critical moment. It will be national suicide not to recognize this elementary truth. We must perceive that if we serve to save the empire, we have in that very act secured home rule." Let me reread that last bit. We must perceive that if we serve to save the empire, we have in that very act secured home rule, independence, self-rule. There was indeed something altogether remarkable about this offer. The very thought that the self-conscious sacrifice of all of India's able-bodied sons could even be countenanced, let alone that it could serve the cause of home rule, strained credibility. Moreover, Gandhi was contending that it was the very act of serving in the war, that is, of fighting, and being prepared to die for the empire, which would secure home rule. Such an act was not a precondition of home rule, but rather home rule itself. Gandhi was in effect asserting an identity between home rule and the willingness and the capacity to die, in this instance, die for the empire. The idea suggests a conception of home rule that is not in any simple sense congruent with ordinary notions of national independence or sovereignty. There was another reason for Gandhi's advocating that Indians fight in support of the empire. Gandhi was aware that the stakes in the First World War were the very survival of the British. It was important to Gandhi that the British not be viewed as enemies. It was essential that they be thought of in a manner that grounded the opposition to the empire on ethical rather than on a political basis. By refusing the distinction between friend and enemy, Gandhi sought to diffuse the psychological terms that linked suffering with resentment, and in turn threatened to make the struggle against the empire into a vicarious lust for the power of the empire. Fighting the British was thus, for Gandhi, doubly motivated. First, as the means to acquire the fitness that was required to secure the grounds of one's own self-rule, and second, in the fact that it helped secure the identity of one's opponent as an ethical subject, and hence one's opposition to him as itself an ethical opposition. Only by vindicating the idea that Indians were the friends of the British, could the real stakes of the opposition to the empire be made fully vivid. In contrast, the nationalist view gave political rationality untrammeled reach, and thus undermined that nexus wherein it had a connection with the ethical and the human. On the same day that Gandhi wrote the letter to the Viceroy, he also wrote to his private secretary, requesting that he, Gandhi, be appointed, quote, recruiting agent-in-chief for the war effort, so that he might, quote, rein men in support of the British fighting effort. As far as I know, this is the only time in Gandhi's life that he asks for a job. And notice the job he's asking for. He's asking for the job to be recruiting agent-in-chief, to recruit young men to fight for the British Empire in Europe. That's the only job Gandhi ever asked for. In this letter in this telegram that he sends to the Viceroy's private secretary, which I'm not quoting here, he lists all the wars that he's fought in South Africa and the First World War. And clearly Gandhi is very, very proud of this curriculum vitae. He is very proud of the fact that he is served in all these wars. And he says so. He says so very explicitly. On the matter of his role as a recruiter for the war, and on his broader insistence that India should fight unconditionally in support of the empire, Gandhi strained many of his closest friendships, both with Indians and Europeans. In a letter he wrote to Esther Faring in June 1918, Gandhi wrote, quote, I felt at once that I was playing with the greatest problem of life in not tackling the question of joining the army seriously. Either one must renounce the benefits of the state or help it to the best of our ability to prosecute the war. We are not ready to renounce. Indians have a double duty to perform. If they are to preach the mission of peace, they must first prove their ability in war. This is a terrible discovery, but it is true. A nation that is unfit to fight cannot from experience prove the virtue of not fighting. I do not infer from this that India must fight, but I say that India must know how to fight. Ahimsa is the eradication of the desire to injure or to kill. End of quote. The terrible discovery was that real non-violence could not just be an abstract value. It had to stem from a profound type of choice in which violence and non-violence were both tactile realities, and in which there was a preparedness for both. One could only exercise the choice in favor of non-violence through the intimate immediacy of the ability to be violent and even to kill. The experience of battle was therefore crucial. It represented the conditions under which choice became fully self-conscious, or to put it in terms that Gandhi might have used, the choice stemmed from the resoluteness of the soul. Gandhi was not just concerned with behavior understood as an externally manifest act, but rather with the internal comportment that backed the behavior. And such comportment turned on placing oneself in a situation where all the abstractness of choice was evacuated and condensed into a corporeal immediacy and intensity. The battlefield was the crucial ground on which courage and fearlessness were manifest. It was only under these conditions that non-violence and self-rule could be vindicated. That is why it did not matter in the context of the First World War that Indians would be fighting to defend the empire. Gandhi went to the extravagant extent of claiming that he was absolutely right in, quote, calling upon every Indian to join the army, always telling him at the same time that he was doing so not for the lust of blood, but for the sake of learning not to fear death. Learning not to fear death. The remark bears repeating because it is at the core of what I have called Gandhi's most radical intervention into Indian modernity. It signaled an account by which by signaling an account of it which resisted its incorporation into familiar European and nationalist patterns. After all, it was precisely the fearing of death, in part because on his view it did not need to be learned, that served as the keystone of the account of modern politics that Thomas Hobbes had offered at the dawn of European modernity. That account, by emphasizing
There's water there.
oh, thank you. That account, by emphasizing the fear of death and the corresponding importance of security as fundamental and natural human attributes, served many purposes. In emphasizing the fear of death as natural and hence ineradicable, Hobbes had laid out the grounds for the permanent importance of the state as the best and only means for assuaging that fear by offering some, however qualified, prospect of security, which, according to Hobbes, was totally absent in the unregulated state of nature. The fear of death and the concern with corporeal safety was thus the enduring and underlying basis of modern politics, according to Hobbes and many others. Gandhi, I've been suggesting, far from wanting to muffle the challenge of death under assurances of politics or subsidiary notions such as sovereignty, wished to make it in all its exacting implications utterly intimate and unsparingly constant. For Gandhi, the absolute and the moral imperative had to ratify themselves by something much more mundane: courage and fearlessness in the face of death. In this orientation, there was an altogether different vision of life, in which the transcendent was nested within the routines of everyday life. Gandhi also abstained from grounding his ethics in broad narratives of society and social development. He was indifferent to the historicism that is essential to these narratives, because nothing of any importance in Gandhi turns on the logic of historical development. He viewed satyagraha as something which escaped the political and social processes with which history was typically concerned. Quote, "Satyagraha, being natural, is not rooted in history." End of quote. This did not mean that he thought of human beings as living in some timeless zone of immobility, only that he did not accept the typical social and political narratives which history offered as the basis of individual and collective self-understanding. He did not, for example, think that Indian civilization had to or should conceive of itself as bound to a teleology whose inevitable outcome was the nation state or a condition of economic modernity. There is here a resonance with Kant's idea of enlightenment. Like Kant, Gandhi abstained from endorsing the driving fictions that are internal to grand historical narratives, accounts such as class struggle or the increase in the productive forces, or the logic of capitalist development, or imperialistic expansion, or the impulse to enlarge the domain of social and political freedoms through constitutional commitments. Gandhi was never drawn to the never drawn to the dream of a new kind of society or of a new kind of man. Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian poet and sage, often objected to Gandhi's call for satyagraha on the grounds that the demand of self-sacrifice was only appropriate for heroes and not for the common man or woman. There was a democratic sensibility in Tagore's objection because it vouched for the mundane fears and hopes of the common man and woman. Gandhi rejected these suggestions, but they gave him pause. But Gandhi's emphasis on courage and fearlessness also had a democratic sensibility informing it. It was different. It drew its inspiration from an older, chivalric and spiritual tradition of self-exploration that was less preoccupied with questions of power and order. Nevertheless, it was democratic in its basic psychological insight and moral hopes and expectations. When Gandhi wrote to Charlie Andrews that non-violence could only be taught by a Kshatriya, that is a warrior, to another Kshatriya, that is, non-violence can only be taught by a warrior to another warrior, and that untouchables and Kshatriyas as castes celebrated the same common human capacity for courage and the possibility of overcoming fear, he was expressing a different but nevertheless democratic ideal of human potential. Gandhi recognized that actualizing this potential required a kind of extremism of the self through practices of celibacy, fasting, courting death, and other forms of what one might call self-vigilance and mortification. These qualities had none of the balance and ordered unity that the poet Tagore identified with art, religion, and creativity, and which he admired, especially in the cosmological poems of Blake and, of course, in musical meter. For Gandhi, it was the unbounded qualities of love, truth, and faith that were grounded in a deep, that were the ground of a deeply spiritual life. But each of these qualities was only enabled by another unbounded quality, namely individual courage. That courage was also the ground of a democratic vision, which, notwithstanding its demanding severity and peculiar excesses, was in principle common to all. It evaded any reliance on the familiar categories of class, caste, ethnicity, and national belonging. Courage and fearlessness were the grounds for a spiritual ascent and searching. They were the basis for self-knowledge and self-confidence, to which Gandhi always gave priority, and which he associated with self-rule in its deepest rendering. For this vision, the gifts and assurances of politics were at best secondary. Gandhi's passions found their clearest focus in the myriad, often apparently trivial details that make up the texture of everyday life. He wanted to infuse that life with the spirit of civility, as he understood it. The courage of being willing to die was deeply entwined with the essential question of the human, which for Gandhi was always conditioned by the transcendent and the utterly mundane. Implicit in this was an exacting vision of a form of democratic life and ethics, democratic simply because it was in principle available to everyone, since courage and fearlessness require neither historical nor social credentials. In a sense, for Gandhi, courage and fearlessness were portals to a sort of spiritual truancy, which he sought to plant in the very midst of the mundane patterns of everyday life. It was one of the many peculiarities of Gandhi as a thinker and as an activist that he often deployed the intensity and urgency of utterly quotidian events such as the introduction of the roulette bills and the First World War, or the struggle for national independence, for his most extravagant spiritual experiments. But even in this, there was a kind of unrelenting consistency, because for Gandhi, the quotidian and the practical always had an intimation of something that exceeded them. Thank you.
That brings to mind the fact that Gandhi was almost always seen weaving
Yes.
with the loom.
Yes.
And weaving is a meditative experience. And I think that it's the secular meditative experience. This is a piece of khadi cloth from from the khadi shop.
Yeah.
And I know people that knew Gandhi and went to prison for Gandhi.
Yeah.
And then there's the deeper meditation where one goes inside.
Yeah.
But on a secular level, the repetitive thing of weaving is like a form of religion.
That's wonderful. There's this wonderful story. The famous American photographer for Time Life, Margaret Burke White, came to see Gandhi in his ashram. And he told her to go, as he did, most people, he told her to go and learn how to spin, how to weave, to spin the chakra. And so she went off to the hut to learn how to spin. And Gandhi happened to see her shortly thereafter, after she was emerging from this lesson or this long morning of trying to learn how to do this thing. And he asked her, so how was it? And she, being an honest American, said, it was boring. And Gandhi said, good, it's meant to be boring. And what I think he meant was that the thing about learning how to spin was that it's not only is it repetitive, you're doing the same thing time and time again. And the idea for Gandhi in spinning was it is that repetitive motion that gives you a sense of timelessness. So the idea that it was boring for him was a form of atemporality. And he associated that boredom with an essential condition of self-searching. Hence the importance of celibacy, of silence. These for him were all practices of the self which, among other things, they had other purposes too, but one crucial purpose they had was to create this kind of sense of atemporality. Sam?
Well, one thing that's sort of hard for me to get a grasp on is maybe someone who's a little bit cynical is how a protest movement that so rejects so many of the things that typically make protest movements effective could be effective. And you seem to be saying that the fact that there is such importance put on self-courage, on personal responsibility, and personal decision-making actually makes this movement stronger, and the fact that it is in a way separate from traditional means of political activism or from the political system. But at the heart, isn't there still, even if they're not these traditional methods of political organization, isn't there still Gandhi at the heart of the center? Can you really have a movement that is simply based on personal responsibility and personal courage without having a figure like Gandhi in the center of it?
the answer to the last part of your question is I don't know. I don't know how important Gandhi or a Mandela is to the movement. Maybe they're essential. What I'm trying to understand is the logic of how they conceptualize movements. And I think the deep insight that Gandhi has is that the danger of political movements, the way they are typically organized, is that they don't, they claim to be protest movements for a particular cause or a particular value. But by valuing numbers, the Leninist idea, the most common idea, numbers is what counts. By valuing numbers, they betray the value, they betray the cause for which they are fighting, and instead become a numerical entity. So Gandhi's point is to say, I think this is what he's saying, is look, what happens to protest movements is they claim to be for, let's say, X value, but then they value numbers, seeing numbers as being the relevant thing to outdoing your opponent, because your opponent has more numbers. What Gandhi is pointing to is the illogic of that you've already let your opponent define you the moment you care about numbers. So what I think he is saying is, look, movements in some sense, for them to be true to the value that they claim, have to be indifferent to numbers. And I think in some ways, protest movements, the story of how protest movements get undone suggests to me that that may be quite accurate.
Uday, how does that fit with the follow-on to the Satyagraha movement in 1919? I mean, the Indian independence movement changes a bit and becomes one of large numbers at some point under Gandhi's guidance. I mean,
Yes.
the ANC would not have won without numbers. The civil rights movement would not have won without some impure members and numbers at the I Have a Dream march or speeches. So I'm just wondering how one balances the core of what you're saying and what Gandhi is saying with the empirical reality that if he had just done the Satyagraha, he never would have. Well, we don't know. You suggested, I think, in your own talk, that it may not have won.
Yeah. See, I'm quite confident in saying that unlike the typical nationalist, let's say Nehru, or let's say Jomo Kenyatta, or Nkrumah, well,
Modi.
huh? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Modi, yeah. Unlike them, there was very little impatience in Gandhi. Gandhi would have let the independence struggle go on for another 100 years. That's not what happened. Maybe he himself became impatient. I don't know. Certainly in India, the nationalist struggle became more nationalist and in that sense impatient. Okay. But I think Gandhi would have said, and he says this in Swaraj, he says two things which appear to be contradictory, but they're not, I think. He says, on the one hand, we can have independence in an instant. And then he goes on to say, Independence should be a long struggle, a really long struggle. A bit like the title of Mandela's autobiography. So, the actual mechanics of what led to independence in 1947 is not purely Gandhi. Gandhi himself, I think, was not in a rush.
Tom?
Yeah, that just got me thinking about the idea of
Speak so people can hear
Okay.
you as well.
yeah. Well, so the fact that the movement kind of became this more populist thing that you're saying about like the struggle should be ongoing and maybe without an end, but yet you can be liberated in a moment. Perhaps, I mean, I'm thinking of like an absurd struggle, an existentialist struggle that is suggesting that like the liberation is not really a moment at all.
Yeah.
There's never a point at which you become free, but you can be free through struggling to be free and insisting on freedom.
Yeah.
So do you think that might have something to do with Gandhi's idea? And
Yeah,
Buddhist philosophy?
yeah. No, I think that captures something of what I think is at the core of his concern. Though the only small kind of editorial remark I would add to that is I'm always a bit uncomfortable identifying Gandhi with notions of freedom. I don't think Gandhi is that concerned with freedom. Or at any rate, let me put it this way. When we talk about Gandhi as being concerned with freedom, I think we're putting the accent in the wrong place. I think he's concerned with something which, for lack of a better term, I'm calling self-knowledge, self-realization. When one says freedom, then there are too many kind of resonances with a kind of liberal conception of, not being oppressed, etc., etc. I don't think those are principally Gandhi's worries. If Gandhi has a conception of freedom, it's much closer to Kant, where Kant's conception of autonomy is ultimately a conception of self-discipline.
Throughout that speech you refer to satyagrahi as a civil, ethical retort while remaining in the midst of that situation. And I noticed that qualifier, while remaining in the midst of that situation. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the importance of that stipulation of being present. And to extend the question, can satyagrahi as a way of life exist without that situation to press up against, without a thing you're resisting? And if so, what does that look like? And would Gandhi approve, etc.? Please.
So I think what he means by acting civilly, which is really what you're asking, what does it mean to act civilly? I think what he means is engaging questions of the human, engaging questions of the absolute, engaging questions such as, what am I prepared to live for? What am I prepared to die for? But doing that in the very midst of to put it in Greek terms, doing that in the agora, not going to a spiritual sanctuary, not going to some cave in the Himalayas to contemplate, but doing it from the midst of everyday life, doing it in a situation which everyone else says, is marked by politicalness. And Gandhi is saying, in the midst of politicalness, in the midst of the most dense kind of politics, one must ask the question of the absolute. One must ask the ethical question. That is, one must never allow the political to be self-sufficient. That's what it means to act civilly. It's what worries Gandhi is when politics is thought of as having a self-sufficient vocabulary. That's what he thinks is ultimately the most instrumental kind of politics. And what I'm suggesting for Gandhi, what it means to act civilly, what satyagraha means is taking something that is densely political and in the middle of it asking an ethical question. It's that not permitting the self-sufficiency.
Right here.
Hi, I have a question. I was intrigued earlier when you were talking about Gandhi's spirituality, obviously a very spiritual person. And I was wondering if his own religion, how it influenced his principles, for instance, like the Bhagavad Gita. And I was wondering how, in the context of broader India with such a diverse religious tradition, how everyone who was involved in that sort of was able to sort of look at sort of the struggle through their own religious experience. And I was just wondering if that was similar for everybody, or if everybody saw it in very different ways.
I'm going to ask you to repeat your question. I
Okay.
stopped concentrating for a minute and I lost it.
Okay, I'm sorry. My question may not be the most coherent, but I was wondering. How Gandhi saw his struggle through the context of his own religion, his own religiosity. For instance, like the Bhagavad Gita. I know he was very into that. And I was wondering if, in broader India with such a diverse religious tradition, I was wondering how other people in the movement sort of looked at the struggle and Gandhi's principles through their own religious interpretations.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it's a very interesting question. Yes. So I think one way to think about it is the following. If I'm right in saying that for Gandhi, religion is in some sense, to put it very crudely, a kind of pick your metaphor, toolbox, book of grammar, whatever it is. It's something that helps you know yourself, to use the old kind of Socratic injunction, know thyself. So religion is just the tool through which you pursue that. Because it is that, Gandhi feels you should be very careful before you start flirting around with somebody else's tools. So as a general matter, though he is not opposed to it, he is very wary of people changing religions. And the reason, I think, quite simply is, to use another metaphor, it would be a bit like somebody who was involved in some very profound, imagine going to your psychiatrist and suddenly saying to your psychiatrist, I really want to have sessions with you, but I'm going to have these sessions in this other language that I'm not fluent in. I'm going to do my string sessions in German, which I can barely speak. Probably be a bad idea, okay? Probably limit how much help you can get from the psychiatrist. So that's one. But for the same reason, Gandhi thinks is accepting of the fact that other traditions have different vocabularies for the same purpose, self-knowledge. So the famous example, you may know it, I think it's also there in the film about Gandhi, the Attenborough film, where in August 1946, there are these riots in the city of Calcutta, and so terrible riots. And Gandhi is fasting, and the riots are not coming to an end, etc., etc. And a Hindu man comes to him, absolutely shaken, despondent, crying, feeling terrible about himself. And Gandhi says, "What's the matter?" And the Hindu says, "I'm finished, I'm done with life." And Gandhi says, "Why?" And he said, "Well, because today I butchered a little Muslim boy, and there's no hope left for me. I'm a murderer. I killed a child in cold blood." So Gandhi says to him, "There is a way for you to find meaning again in life." And so this guy says, "How?" So Gandhi says, "Adopt a Muslim child, but bring him up as a Muslim." So what is Gandhi saying? Gandhi is in some sense saying, you as a Hindu can redeem yourself by bringing up a Muslim to be a Muslim. And that, I think, shows the complex way in which he understands religion. He, of course, always says he's a Hindu. But as he says, the windows of my house have there are many windows in my house, and different religions flow through them. Something like that. Yeah.
In your speech and in your paper, you use Thomas Hobbes as kind of a reference for a train of thought that goes through Western philosophy about the natural world as mainly something to be feared and lead people to seek security.
Yeah.
And Gandhi didn't seem particularly concerned with that kind of material security or even that material causality. And I was wondering if you thought that in the modern world there might be a room for Gandhi's approach towards things, which was more of a metaphysical one and was more in tune with staying true to yourself and kind of these absolute values or the absolute truth or this kind of religious sense and a way of acting outside of the world and not within the narrow confines of kind of being afraid of your fellow man and being afraid of the world and needing security for that reason, but being able to kind of transcend that in a way, if that was a useful way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do think there's something useful, important in that line of Gandhi's thinking, that the kind of, as it were, dialogue that I construct between Hobbes and Gandhi, where look, one way to think about it is the following. What does Hobbes have to do to get his conceptual engine going? What he has to do in the state of nature, he has to construct the state of nature in such a way, not simply that there is a war of all against all, in which each of us has reasons to believe we will die, He has to construct the state of nature to be such that each of us has reasons to fear a painful and violent death. Not simply that we will die. Of course we will all die. Hobbes has to structure the state of nature as a place that will result in a painful and violent death. Only then would you say, hell, I want to get out of here. If they're going to string me up, and, burn me slowly, on some fire, that I don't want. Okay. If I go at the age of 95, of senility, that's fine. Go, So, Gandhi, in a sense, you can think of Gandhi as saying to Hobbes, look, Hobbes, you fudged it. We all die. But we don't necessarily die a painful and violent death. You fooled Western civilization into believing that we would all die a painful and violent death. And because they accepted that account, they came to overvalue security. But there was no real reason to accept that account. If you thought of death as natural, then, But what you, Thomas Hobbes, did was you succeeded in making death unnatural by making it painful and violent. Gandhi is in a sense saying, but if you have a normal conception of death, you'd have a normal conception of security. But Hobbes is so persuasive, he gets you to believe in an unusual conception of death and hence invest in an unusual conception of security.
Are there people who haven't asked questions at one of the lectures before who might have the courage to speak? Yes, okay, who?
I'm a little bit unclear regarding Gandhi's view on violence. I'm wondering what you think the ethical difference is, not just the political difference, but the ethical difference between Indians going to war and risking their lives versus Indians rioting and risking their lives.
Indians what?
Rioting after Gandhi was in prison.
Yeah.
Because they're both sacrificing their lives, potentially, and they're both committing acts of violence. And so couldn't perhaps the rioting lead them to realize that violence is immoral and thus follow ahimsa through experience, as in going to war?
It could, but for Gandhi it is highly unlikely. The simple reason being that he sees the rioting as stemming from a certain kind of lack of discipline, while he sees the act of going to war as requiring thought and discipline. So what rioting is a good example because he thinks riots are of two kinds. He's quite explicit about this. One is a planned riot where you're actually planning to be disruptive or go and kill somebody, etc. And that's bad because it's a kind of premeditated act of violence. The other kind of riot he thinks of is riots that stem from a certain kind of lack of courage, a certain kind of impetuosity, a certain kind of anger. You just get pissed off that Gandhi is about to be imprisoned and you go berserk. That's why the whole point of his instructions to the potential satyagrahis is only sign the pledge if you're prepared to be utterly disciplined. So it's not just that are you prepared to risk your life or are you prepared to do something in which your life is at risk. The rioter risks her life. But for Gandhi, that risking of life is not backed by the appropriate comportment. Do you see the difference?
So do you think Gandhi would condone suicide bombing?
I don't think so at all. I think Gandhi, for Gandhi, there was a huge difference between suicide and self-sacrifice. Suicide for him is always an act, or suicide bombing, or it's all actually. One person who I think doesn't see this distinction is George Orwell. George Orwell, in his review of Gandhi's autobiography that I think comes out the review comes out in 1941, Orwell says Gandhi asked the Jews of Germany to commit suicide. He never asked them to commit suicide. He asked them to consider collective self-sacrifice. Well, collective not as a collectivity, but as individuals. The difference for Gandhi was that through self-sacrifice, they were showing Hitler and the Nazis a certain, what he calls, they would be showing Hitler and the Nazis the value they put in their honor. But suicide for him was just a kind of instrumental act. It didn't show yourself to be valuing yourself or your honor. So I don't think he would have sanctioned. There are other reasons why I don't think he would have sanctioned suicide bombing, because.
Well, what would collective self-sacrifice mean? I mean, what I mean, walking calmly up into the gas chambers? Is that no?
I don't think it meant that. So the example he gives in his famous, he writes these 4 pieces on they're called the Jews in Germany. So the point he makes there is, this is of course before the concentration camps, but after the Nuremberg laws. So he's writing this in November 39, 36 or 37 maybe. So he's saying, so the Nuremberg laws, the discriminatory laws have come into effect, okay? So he's saying, he says, look, and I'm not capturing all the qualifications he puts, but it's a very, very, very interesting set of articles he writes. He says, if I was born and bred and earned my livelihood in Germany or France, or Germany, I would stand up to these discriminatory laws, even at the expense of my life. Now, I think it's very important how he qualifies this. By saying, if I was born and bred and earned my livelihood in Germany, then I'm as German. His point is, then I'm as German as the most pure Aryan German. And I would stand up for that. So, what he's saying is, look, I think what he's saying, what he means is, what it means to be German rests on something very mundane. Do I live here? Was I born here? Do my folks live here? Do I earn my livelihood here? That's all it turns on. And what the Nazis are doing is they're making Germanness stand on this completely abstract thing of, whatever. And Gandhi is saying that principle is wrong. And for that principle, so I would stand up for that mundane principle of Germanness at the risk of my life. And and then he goes on to say, because Gandhi also has this view that evil people lack courage. That's a complicated other story. He says, he personally believes that, he's only wrong on this completely, but that if the Jews had done this, the Nazis would not have had the courage. If they had not, nothing is totally wrong.
There's a similar story in Hannah Arendt's Life in Jerusalem, where she says that in those places, like Denmark and Sofia and Bulgaria, where people did stand up and say to the Nazis, we won't participate in this, the Nazis did not have the courage to carry through the final solution in those places, and most Jews were saved.
Yeah, and she got into a lot of trouble.
And she got into a lot of trouble for that. Are there other questions? We have time for a couple more questions, especially like some students, maybe who are women, to ask some questions. Yes, please.
I was thinking about Rabindranath Tagore's criticism of Gandhi, and I was thinking that Gandhi is very extraordinary, but I also feel like the fact that he's so concerned with the extraordinary fights and not so concerned with the everyday fights, I think that's where Rabindranath Tagore's criticism is very, how do I say it, like very insightful, because I think in not taking into consideration the everyday struggle, I think he's sort of making it a very exclusive fight, and not exclusive as in morally exclusive, but exclusive in the sense that when you think about how like his conception of the fight is sort of informed by his conception of asceticism, and since asceticism is something that is a very exclusive practice, and it's exclusive in the sense that it's exclusive to men, I feel like he's like designed the Indian nationalist fight to be very sort of, how do I say it, upper class Indian male, like how would a woman whose highest virtue is achieved through giving birth to a child become a satyagrahi? Like when.
Okay, I'm going to. You've said a number of very thoughtful things, and I'm going to break it up into two questions, if you don't mind. One, I think you're asking, wasn't Tagore, in his criticism of Gandhi, in some sense pointing to an aspect of Gandhi in which Gandhi was, as it were, vouching for or celebrating the heroic? And Tagore, in some sense, was speaking on behalf of the mundane. Right? And the second part of the question, I think, is wasn't there, or I think you're asking, wasn't there in Gandhi a certain kind of, as it were, hidden classism and even sexism, where you couldn't actually meet Gandhian standards if you weren't upper caste or male.
And I'm not to undervalue everything that Gandhi has said, but just kind of like, or not to like make it, not to sort of like make Gandhi seem like a bad, like you know, like without attributing good or bad qualities to sexism, without attributing good or bad qualities to classism.
I agree. So, I mean, you may be right. Here, let me try and defend Gandhi. Okay? I'm not sure how accurate this is. I don't know how right this is. So here's what Gandhi would say to Tagore. Look, I think the common man is capable of being a hero. I think the common man is capable of doing something exceptional. I think all human beings are capable of doing something exceptional because that's what it means to be human. What it means to be human is to be involved in this profound struggle to achieve one's humanity. And I believe anyone can do it. I'm not saying that the only way to do this is by going to war. One does it every day. One does it in everyday acts of life. So I don't think for Gandhi, if you aren't doing something perilous, like going out onto the fields in Flanders and getting your head blown off, you aren't being, it's not that. Everyone, and you don't have to be a hero to do it. He thinks, as I said towards the end of my talk, that there is something deeply democratic in Gandhi's conception of the heroic, of the exceptional. And if you read his letters, etc., what you'll be struck by is the enormous detail he puts on mundane things, on the simplest of things. I mean, I'll give you one example that I find, for some reason, really interesting. Gandhi used to write a lot of letters, he used to write them with pencil, he needed a lot of sharp pencils to write them. Right? And there was somebody, as it turns out it was a woman, who used to sharpen his pencils for him. And in the morning, because I write these letters every morning. So one day he noticed that the way the pencil was sharpened with a penknife. So he noticed the way the pencil had been sharpened, it suggested very harsh cuts on the pencil. They weren't even cuts. So when she comes, he says to her, look, I noticed that the way you sharpened my pencils, the cuts were very harsh. And I have a feeling, judging from those cuts, this is Gandhi the hermeneutician, judging from the way the pencil was sharpened, I have a feeling you're quite angry at having to sharpen my pencils. Is that true? So she demurred and says, yes, I think it is true. Please don't sharpen my pencils. I would rather you not be angry. I would rather have blunt pencils than having you angry. So what does this suggest? For me, it suggests that it's in these very mundane acts that Gandhi sees something like anger or a kind of spiritual quest betrayed. So it's not just in these kind of big things. On the question of caste and women, look, there are many ways to actually answer your question. I want to answer it at a kind of rather conceptual level. And I think at that level, Gandhi comes off a lot better than he comes off if you answer it at some other level. Answer it at some other level, he comes off as a damn sexist, okay? Because he probably was by our standards. But at a more abstract level, I think, I don't think he's quite that easy. I don't think he's that kind of clearly a sexist. I mean, one, look, the ashrams were all open to men, women, upper caste, lower caste. You know, among the biggest fights he ever had, which is well documented with his own wife, was when, when he said he was prepared to clean the toilets of an untouchable, I guess. But at the more abstract level, look, if you go back to what I said earlier in response to your question, that I'm a bit uncomfortable thinking of Gandhi as being concerned with freedom. He's concerned with something else. Okay? He's concerned with, for lack of a better term, let's just call it self-knowledge, self-realization. So one of the things Gandhi is often doing is he's asking of people. He's seldom saying to people, do whatever the hell you want to do. Instead, he's saying, do that which will make you more fully yourself. Which is very different than saying, do whatever the hell you want to do. Do whatever the hell you want to do is saying, create a big choice set. Do that which will make you more fully yourself is saying, ask yourself the question, who am I? Try and realize that. Once you're involved in that enterprise, then you're not saying, oh, well, women should have the same freedom as men. That's not where you put the accent. That's just isn't the game he's playing. He's not doing that liberal game. He's asking a question which is more closely tied to the logic of authenticity. Be more fully yourself. Once you do that, then you're not going to be saying, well, men and women are equal. That's just an abstract claim. It's not a particular kind of abstraction Gandhi's into. It's for the same reason that I think Gandhi is not into freedom, he's not into equality either. It's just not the thing that matters to him. I mean, that's not to say that he's into hierarchy, but he's not like your typical liberal who'd say, he'd look at a situation and say, oh, wow, this is unequal, and from that conclude it's got to be made equal. That's just not the way he thinks.
Uday, there are 3 required texts in this course that these students are all taking. One is some Arendt, personal responsibility and dictatorship, and some other texts. One is The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich, and the other is Emerson's Self-Reliance. One of the things that all 3 of those texts share is a concern with the self.
No.
So for Arendt, thinking, which she says may be the source of moral courage, is a conversation with oneself. Tillich is about self-affirmation, which he says can only happen if you have something to affirm, and that comes from this idea of faith in a God beyond God. And Emerson, as you know, in Self-Reliance says, it doesn't mean just do what you want, it's be true to yourself, the iron string of your soul. You've certainly convinced me that we could add a fourth text to the course, right? Gandhi, self. I'm just interested in, for all these people, the problem is, what is the self?
Yeah.
And this comes back to a couple of the questions as well, but, you know, is the self this, you know, obviously, you don't want to say the self is whatever you believe, is opinion, is belief, is just, you know, etc. And yet, outside of a religious world, and this goes back to the first question, outside of religion, or Socratic reason, or here's what you started with, Kantian reason, right? Kantian know thyself can only not be relativist because there's a rationalist bias to know thyself. Where today, I mean, weaving was mentioned, right? You practice weaving, silence, but there's something you're supposed to know. We all have a sense of what the right self is that we're gonna find out. And yet we live in a world in which there's complete disagreement. I mean, suicide bombers, do they know themselves? Martyrs, religious martyrs, do they know themselves? Someone who kills abortion doctors or bombs the Atlanta Olympics, did they, out of a courageous belief that what they're doing is right? What is the practice of the self today? I mean, this is beyond Gandhi, right? But I'm asking you to think about, in a sense, what this means for us today, this know thyself. And I know it's a big question, but I mean, you've thought about this, I know. So.
Let me try and answer this question the only way I know how to, which is very indirectly. So, when Gandhi says to upper caste Hindus, look, you should give up on the practice of untouchability. Upper caste Hindus come back and say to him, what do you mean we should give up on the practice of untouchability? It is integral to our selfhood. It's integral to our religion. And you, Mr. Authenticity, who are you to say give up on untouchability when it's integral to our religion? So what's Gandhi's response? So Gandhi's response is roughly like this, I think. If you, as an upper caste Hindu, in fact drink water from a well that is where the water has been drawn by an untouchable, and if you, as an upper caste Hindu, clean the toilet of an untouchable, and you do that for a month, you will realize, my friend, that it doesn't mess with your sense of selfhood. In realizing that, you will realize that your sense that the practice of untouchability was integral to your authentic self was wrong. Try it. Try it for a month and see. So what is Gandhi doing? Gandhi is thinking like an experimental scientist. He has a conception of error. he has a sense that people believe all sorts of things that are completely screwed up about the self. But the way to get them to unlearn this is through these alternative practices of the self. So that's what he says to his wife. He says to his wife, look, just see what happens after a month of us eating together with this untouchable. See what happens. See if it messes up your conception of self. He's wagering it won't. He says something similar on behalf of, he says something similar to those communities in India, alas, the community to which I belong, where there was the practice of burning widows, sati, after the husband had died. So he says roughly to them, he doesn't say, stop practicing sati. He does say that at one level. But he says something slightly different. He says, look, if you stop burning your widows, I assure you that you will not feel, as it were, set adrift in some metaphysical ocean. I assure you that. Try it. Try it. See if you can tolerate the sight of a widow. You'll be able to do it. So, I am not answering your question, Roger, but what I'm trying to do is suggesting that there is, Gandhi doesn't kind of swing us into or chuck us into some relativistic river where everything goes. He has a conception of error. He has a conception of false knowledge. So for him, what upper caste Hindus in their belief in untouchability, they invested in an error, an untruth. And he thinks through practice you can unlearn that untruth. So I can't answer the question, what are the practices of the self, beyond saying that I think for Gandhi, and I suspect for the others, certainly for Emerson, the task is also tied up with a very firm commitment to a certain kind of experimentalism. It's not for nothing that Gandhi calls his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. There is a kind of experimentalism there. It's not as though there is some sense of a settled self and you go out and, meet it. No, it's a much, much more interpretive, much, much more hermeneutic endeavor where you're struggling. and for Gandhi, there's a very, there's a passage in the beginning, in the second paragraph of his autobiography, which somehow I always think it's a very important passage, where he says, look, there are some things that are known only to me and my maker. Those things I can't write about. That's a kind of conversation that he's always having with his maker. Some people call this the Christian's Gandhi. It's the idea of returning to the right hand of God. Well, whatever. But this idea that this part of what's going on is this ongoing conversation with his maker. And that can't be transcribed in an autobiography. That's a personal struggle. It's a personal issue. It requires silence, etc.
Well, we will be silent. Please join me in thanking Professor Uday Mehta.